Hello, everyone. My name is Tom McCoy, and the big picture question that I'll be focusing on today is how can we reason about the strengths and limitations of language models? This question is becoming increasingly important as language models become increasingly widely adopted. It's important for us to know, important for us to figure out when we can trust them and when we cannot, and it's also important for measuring and motivating progress as we develop new language models. Large language models can be used for an enormous variety of tasks. You can use them to produce computer code or to summarize text or to translate from one language to another. And in fact, you can, in principle, use a language model for pretty much any task because pretty much any task can be framed as a textual query. Of course, they won't necessarily do well on every task, but they can at least make an attempt on it. This generality is extremely exciting. It's one of the most exciting properties of large language models, but it also poses a real problem for our ability to understand them. Because we can only run a finite number of tests, so how can we possibly hope to evaluate and understand systems whose potential scope is infinite? The approach that I'll be arguing for is to understand large language models via the pressures that have shaped them. So the basic outline here is you start by identifying the pressures that have shaped the system, and then you reason about what strategies would a system be likely to adopt in response to these pressures, and then ask if a system is using that strategy, what strengths and limitations would it have? In what settings would the strategy work well or poorly? So this general approach is very well known from evolutionary biology, where it's commonplace to try to understand organisms by analyzing what evolutionary pressures have shaped them. In this talk, I'll be discussing how this approach can help us understand large language models, and I'll also motivate how linguistics is really central to this endeavor. So we refer to this approach as the teleological approach, where teleological means goal-oriented, and most of what I'll be discussing comes from this paper called Embers of Autoregression, which is written with some fantastic co-authors, Shunyu Yao, Dan Friedman, Matt Hardy, and Tom Griffiths. In order to make this more concrete, I'm going to start with a task called article swapping. This task is very contrived, but I picked it to start with because it really helps to illustrate some of the points I'm making. So in this task, a system is given a sequence of words, and it's told to swap each article with the word that comes before it. And it's also told that an article is the word a, an, or the. So in this case, there are two articles, the and a, and if you swap each of them with the word before it, you would get in the box, there was a key. So now let's think about, using this teleological perspective, how we might expect a language model would go about solving this task. So first, we should ask, what are the pressures that shape language models? And I guess when we're talking about humans, as came up in the commentary, it's pretty tricky to say what the things are that humans are trying to accomplish. But with language models, it is easier to get a handle on what they're being optimized for because we've defined the training objective as next word prediction over internet text. Maybe also with some other bells and whistles like RLHF, but at least to a first approximation, a lot of what they're trained to do is next word prediction. And now we can reason about if this is the pressure or the goal that the system is being trained to optimize for, what strategies would it adopt? And the answer to this question is also quite straightforward. It would be statistical inference over word sequences, because this is just the right strategy to use if you're trying to do next word prediction. And then finally, we can ask, what sorts of behaviors would we expect from a system that is doing statistical inference over word sequences? And one aspect of behavior we would expect is that the system would be sensitive to the probability of the sequences they need to produce. So we have the Bayesian argument about why this should be the case. I'm not going to go through that argument because I think it's pretty intuitive. Just the point that we would expect a statistical sequence processing system to do better on examples when the sequence they need to produce is high probability than when the sequence is low probability, because they're going to be influenced by the prior probability of that sequence. Even in settings where the prior probability really shouldn't matter, there still will be some kind of intrusive effects of that prior probability. So we can investigate this by looking at how language models perform on some actual examples. So first, here's an example where the correct answer is a high probability sequence of words. The sentence, "It does not specify a time limit for the registration procedures." So this is a very plausible grammatical sentence. We got it from a newspaper article. And when the correct output is that sentence, GPT-4 gets it exactly correct. But now here's another example where the correct answer is a very low probability sequence of words. It, few, with, it, to, lying, the, take, get, a, jest, hands, would, kinds. It's hard to even read this. It's just totally scrambled. And here, GPT-4 gets the answer wrong, which provides some anecdotal evidence that it struggles when the correct output is a low probability sequence of words. But the thing I think is really instructive here is to look at what it actually produces, which is it flew with a few kinds to take the lying just to get the hands. You can really see the ways in which ChatGPT is sort of pooling the answer closer to the higher probability space of language. The sentence overall still isn't really very sensible, but if you look at any local, 2 or 3 word chunk, you could imagine it occurring in an actual sentence. So this is pretty anecdotal, but we also have more systematic quantitative results. So along the horizontal axis, we're showing the log probability of the correct output. The vertical axis shows accuracy. And we see that both GPT 3.5 and GPT 4 have accuracy that varies enormously as the probability changes. So for instance, for GPT-4, the accuracy ranges from 2% in the lowest probability setting to 83% in the highest probability setting, which is just an enormous range of variation. Now, that task, as I said, was pretty contrived, but just to show that this also applies in some less contrived settings, we also looked at the task of counting words in a list, where we give the system a list, such as lively news exhibit steep, and then ask it how many words are in the list. And so the way we'll be presenting these results is along the x-axis, we have the size of the number the model needs to count to, and along the y-axis, we have the accuracy at counting for lists of that length. And now, a priori, if we don't think about how the system works, you might expect that we would just see accuracy gradually and monotonically decreasing as the numbers increase. But that's not what we see. What we see instead is this really interesting pattern where once you get past numbers of around 30, the accuracy is mostly 0%, except we get these huge spikes, often near 100% of particular numbers. And it's not on random numbers, it's at numbers that are multiples of 10 or multiples of 5. And so the reason this makes sense is that language models are trained to learn the statistical patterns of text that was produced by humans. Humans really like round numbers, such as multiples of 10. So if you do the corpus analysis, round numbers are much more common in natural text corpora than less round numbers. And therefore, a statistical system trained on natural text will have a much easier time producing a round number like 50 than a non-round number like 49. So the interim takeaway here is language models are trained on natural language. So in order to understand them, we need to understand what patterns are prevalent in naturally occurring text, because this factor is going to play an enormous role in determining which types of examples and tasks a language model will find easy or difficult. And linguistics provides the relevant tools, the tools that we need in order to understand what patterns are prevalent in a corpus of text. So this now takes us to the question of the session, the question of what insights does the study of human language provide for large language model development? Well, I'm now going to zoom out and take a slightly more general answer to this question. So in general terms, what linguistics provides is it provides characterizations of how language works. And different subfields of linguistics provide these characterizations for many different aspects of language. So we have characterizations of language use, language structure, language processing, language learning, the relation between language and society, many other dimensions. And there are several different ways in which these characterizations are useful for developing and understanding language models. So the one I've talked about so far is we can use characterizations from linguistics as a source of hypotheses about how we might expect language models to behave. Because the properties we see in natural language use, we should expect to see reflected inside language models that are trained on language use. I'm now going to talk about a second situation where these characterizations can be useful, namely as standards for evaluation. So this is talking about this paper, Right for the Wrong Reasons, co-authored with Ellie Pavlik and Tal Linzen, where a phenomenon we're focusing on here is how meaning gets constructed from a sentence. So one of the core ideas in semantics, at least in many theories of semantics, is that meanings are constructed in a hierarchical tree structured manner that roughly parallels the syntactic structure of a sentence. So for example, to get the meaning of purple walruses laugh loudly, you would first compose the meaning of purple with the meaning of walruses to get the meaning for purple walruses. Then you would also compose the meaning of laugh with the meaning of loudly to get a meaning for laugh loudly, and then combine the meanings of those two phrases to get the meaning for purple walruses laugh loudly. And so because this is one of the really core properties of how meaning works in language, we might well want to be able to tell if a given language model has captured the fact that meaning works in this way. So the question is, how can we answer that question? Well, there's a really fantastic task called natural language inference, which is very broadly useful for understanding how meaning works. So Adina and Chris, among others, have created some really beautiful data sets for this task. The way this task works is you give a system two sentences. such as Alex is running down the street and Alex is asleep, and then it has to label what the semantic relationship is between these two sentences. So here it would be contradiction, or if the sentences were Chris visited London and Paris and Chris visited London, the label would now be entailment, meaning that if the first sentence is true, the second sentence must also be true. Now, many current language models perform extremely well on this task, which we might take as evidence that they must have learned the tree-based nature of meaning, given that meaning depends on tree structure, and they're doing very well on this meaning-sensitive task. But there is one difficulty, which is that models might be getting the right answers in ways that do not involve the type of tree structure composition that we are intending to evaluate here. That is, these data sets that the models are doing well on are very useful as general benchmarks of how the models are handling meaning, but they won't necessarily get at this specific phenomenon we're trying to investigate, this phenomenon of tree-based composition. So what we need to ask then is, if they're not doing tree-based composition, what would they be doing? Well, the hypothesis we'll be running with is they might be using strategies that instead of being based on trees are based on linear substrings. So for example, they might adopt the strategy of assuming the label is entailment anytime the second sentence is a linear substring of the first. Why would we hypothesize this? Well, it comes back to some teleological reasoning about how these models work and what they were trained to do. So first, standard language models operate over linear sequences of words, so we might expect that strategies based on linear sequences would be more attractive to them than strategies based on tree structure. And second, if you do a corpus analysis of standard data sets, we find that these sequential heuristics produce the correct answer much more often than they produce the incorrect answer. And so we might well expect a data-driven learner trained on such corpora to learn to adopt this heuristic. But the reason it's not the valid reasoning strategy is that there are cases where this sequential heuristic fails. And so, in fact, we identified many such cases by looking at the psycholinguistics literature, which identifies areas where humans sometimes use the incorrect parts of the sentence. So, for example, Alice believes Mary is lying does not imply that Alice believes Mary, even though the second sentence is a linear substring of the first. And so to test whether models are using this sequential-based strategy or tree-based composition, we created this challenging evaluation set called Hans, which contains some examples where the hypothesized heuristic succeeds and others where it fails. We found that on the evaluation examples where the heuristic gives the right answer, all of the models that we investigated got nearly 100% accuracy. But then on the examples where the heuristic gives the incorrect prediction, now all four of these models did very poorly. They're in fact doing much worse than the chance level accuracy of 50%, which provides some pretty strong evidence that they are using this hypothesized heuristic rather than the tree-based composition. So now zooming out of that natural language inference case study, this one actually showcased both of these first two ways in which characterizations from linguistics can be helpful for understanding large language models. So first, we can use ideas from linguistics as a standard for evaluation. So here we can have some abstract idea from linguistics that we use to describe what we might want to see in a model. So in this case, what we want to see is hierarchical tree-based meaning composition. And then we can also use techniques from linguistics as a source of hypotheses about what we are likely to get, what types of strategies we would expect a model to have. So in this case, we would expect models to use strategies based on linear sequential strings of words. And I think it can be very powerful to have both of these things put together. So both the characterization of what we want and also hypotheses about what we're likely to get, because then when we have both of these, we're able to judge how far what we're getting is from what we want. Okay. There are many other fantastic data sets that have also used aspects of linguistics as standards for evaluation, things that we want to evaluate against. So including work from Marvin and Linzen, or Hu et al., or Alex Worstead et al. And I think Najing will also be talking about many of these things in mere moments. Then I'm going to talk about a third and final way in which characterizations from linguistics are useful for language model development, which is as a target for optimization. So I'm not going to get into this in detail at all, but the rough idea is that if we have some abstract linguistic ability that we want a model to have, well, so far I've shown how we can use this as a basis for evaluation, but another way we can use it is we can create a formal grammar that generates examples which would illustrate this formal ability. And then we can sample examples from this formal grammar and use those examples as additional training data that we give to a language model. So we took this approach in this paper with Tom Griffiths and found that it can be successful at getting neural networks to generalize better on certain types of abstract formal structures that we can instantiate in formal grammars. So this is a way in which abstract ideas from linguistics can not just help us evaluate, but can also help us improve system performance. Now, there are a couple of limitations I definitely want to highlight here. So the first is that this teleological perspective is not at all the only way to understand language models. It should be accompanying other perspectives rather than replacing them. So one big reason why we should not be using it as the only way we think about these systems is that this way of thinking can definitely be misleading. And in particular, there's a risk of being overly reductive. So one way you can frame this perspective is we look at the ingredients that go into the system and reason about what you would get when you put those ingredients together. This works very well in settings where the model's behavior is the sum of its parts. But to the extent that there are emergent properties that are not the sum of the parts, then you will miss it by using this teleological perspective. And so in order to capture such things, you definitely need other strategies that would be able to find potential emergent properties. Another thing I worry slightly about my choice of examples is that they might seem overly negative, which was not at all my goal. So I think it is important to note that teleological thinking can illuminate model strengths, not just model weaknesses. So for example, in this paper with Polswinski, Tolinson, John Fangao, and Asla Chilikilmaz, we looked at the question of whether language models are merely copying things they've seen before, as opposed to generalizing in new ways, creating new syntactic combinations, for example. And we use this sort of hypothesis-driven perspective to investigate this question. And here the answer was much more positive about language model abilities. They really are generating substantial amounts of new syntactic structures and morphological combinations. So it's really not valid to say that language models are merely copying. And more generally, in some ways, this teleological perspective actually makes large language models even more impressive than they otherwise would seem, because it's truly amazing that these systems can do tasks like counting or word swapping at all. It's really not something you would expect a word prediction system to be doing. So sure, they're not perfect, but it's still impressive that they're getting anything above 0% accuracy on these tasks. So to wrap up, if you look at paper titles from the past few years in AI, you will find many statements about what language models are. Language models are unsupervised multitask learners. Language models are few-shot learners. Language models are general purpose interfaces. Language models are open knowledge graphs. All of these statements are fascinating, and we absolutely should be investigating these potential emergent properties. At the same time, however, we also need to be remembering a much simpler fact, which is that language models are language models. That is, they are models of language. And therefore, in order to understand language models, we must understand language, because language is the domain that language models are being trained to mirror. And therefore, we really ought to expect that the properties of language are going to play a major role in determining how language models work. And so this creates a definite role for linguistics in advancing language models, because linguistics gives us the tools for understanding how language works, which we can then use to understand how language models do work or how we might want them to work. And with that, thanks to my funding sources, including NSF funding sources, and thank you all for listening.